All right. Good morning. I'm going to do something radical this morning and give you the assigned Bible reading first. Today, that means that we're hearing from Luke chapter 9. It's a familiar story, the story of the Transfiguration. It's well known, important enough in the Gospels that all three synoptic Gospels, which means Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of them include it. And it gets put in each year of the 3-year cycle. It gets its own special Sunday, which is the last Sunday before Lent starts, Transfiguration Sunday. That's today. And as is often the case with stories that we hear a lot, the very familiarity of it can make us lose sight of its strangeness. But the strangeness sometimes is what prompts us to have new insights. So maybe we can hear it as a very weird story this morning. This is it. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, some difficult conversation that Jesus had with his followers, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him 3 of them, Peter and James and John, and went up on a mountain to pray. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they all saw 2 other men, Moses and Elijah, standing there talking with him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which is a soft way of saying death, maybe, that he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but they had managed to stay awake, so they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. And just as they were starting to leave, Peter said to Jesus, "Teacher, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah," not really knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came in and overshadowed them all, and they were terrified as it rolled over them. And then a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my child, my chosen one. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silence. And in those days, they didn't tell anyone what they had seen. Have you ever felt broken open, maybe from beauty or from compassion or from grief or from something you don't quite have a name for? Do you know the feeling that I'm trying to get at? A feeling of being broken open. In this week's all church email, I invited you to bring in an object or a story with you. This is how I put it in the email. Can you think of a time when your best self was drawn out of you? Maybe in a moment that you didn't expect. And or is there an object you have that carries significance for you beyond what anyone else would guess just by looking at it? Something you might even go so far as to call holy. I brought mine. In fact, I never leave home without it. It's a particular stretch from the first movement of John Coltrane's A Love Supreme. A piece of it I got tattooed around my arm last spring for my 50th birthday, as it happens. From A Love Supreme. Some of you have heard me preach on that several years ago. I'm happy to talk more with anyone about it at lunch. But it is something that every time I listen to it brings something more and deep out of me. In fact, when I shared it with a group of clergy friends, one of my friends had a bona fide mystical experience. It was pretty powerful. I've never had that. But, so did anyone bring a story or an object? No? Nyla? You did? Nyla, do you mind telling us? You don't have to. You didn't realize that you were going to get put on the spot. I know. Well, see, no. You were the only one who raised your hand, so you can put your hand back down if you want. I don't know.
So I didn't bring the object associated with this, but I have a piece of bark from a Joshua tree from Joshua Tree National Park, where I visited last year. And I will say I am a tree hugger, so no surprise there. But I was in the park, and I was with some friends of mine, and everybody was like, let's take a photo in front of this tree, and they're organizing themselves. And I just had the impulse to just put my arms around the tree, rest my head in sort of like one of the crooks in the branches. And I don't know how long I stayed there like that for, but I felt so much love and gratitude emanating from that tree. I've never, ever had an experience like that before. It was like the tree was just so happy to like receive me, and I received the tree. And I started crying because it was just so beautiful, and my friends are still just like oblivious taking their photo. And then I remember walking through the park after that, and everything around me felt infinitely more beautiful and infinitely more precious. And it felt like the stones were speaking to me, and like the birds were speaking to me. And it just reminded me of our sort of entanglement and kinship with the more than human world that we so often forget. And so I have this piece of bark that sits on my altar to remind me of that.
Thank you. Thank you for being willing to be put on the spot. I think you also had a moment with a whale, right? You wrote a poem about that. Sandy also had a moment with a whale, and I noticed that neither one of you brought a whale this morning. So but thank you for that. If other people have stories, I encourage you to share them with each other over lunch or afterwards or online. Another one of my own broken open moments. Often there are moments that make me weep. You all know that I'm weepy. Many of you do. And I wonder, maybe we can call them transfigurations for today. These moments of being broken open to something. It happened for me just a couple of weeks ago. And I'm going to tell you about it, but first I have to tell you about Reginald Dwayne Betts. He is a felon. That is not the most important thing to know about him, but it is a thing that he is open about. And in fact, it is the title of his third volume of poetry. Reginald Dwayne Betts grew up in Prince George's County, Maryland, which is just one county over from where I grew up. He was an honor student. He was his class treasurer in high school. And then at 16 years old, he did something stupid and violent and spent the next 8 years of his life in prison, more than a year of it in solitary confinement. What he's done since then includes writing essays, a memoir, now 4 volumes of poetry. He's earned a law degree, speaks out for juvenile justice reform. He's a spokesperson of Campaign for Youth Justice. And among other notes of distinction, he's been awarded both a Guggenheim Fellowship and a MacArthur Fellowship. So very accomplished. I knew all or most of this already a couple of weeks ago when I sat in High Point Cafe and opened up one of the 3 daily poetry emails I get. It held a poem from his 4th collection, Doggerel, that is coming out this week, as it happens. I can't say how much knowing all of this shaped my original experience of that poem, but I'm certain that it did, which is why I share it with you. So here's a reading that on a non-Transfiguration Sunday I'd have used as the very first thing we heard this morning. This is called White Peonies by Reginald Dwayne Betts. This is how it happens. One morning, the ground is only the ground. And then green shoots through the rich brown loam. I learned the word loam when I was starving for something. Fools would call it love, and I would say it was a time machine, longing for some days, months, years, when the sorrows didn't bloom like this thing from the ground that I can barely name. Tell me how these peonies have migrated from Asia to my garden, have found their way into my line of vision, despite prison and all the suffering I don't speak. It all happens so sudden, is what I mean to say. When sadness becomes a beauty before your eyes, so startling, you ask friends what to name the flower before you. I admit I've pretended to be God, to give a name to this thing that gives me joy. I called it Sunday, and then I called it after my firstborn. Have you ever been so rattled by the unexpected that you wanted someone's blessing to name the thing? The peonies are so lovely, they frighten me. They grow on thin stems longer than my arms, with blooms heavier than the stalks. But isn't it always so? The beauty of the world, so hefty, we fear the world cannot stand it. And yet, why would we not want to pray when we notice? Why do we forget that naming is the first kind of prayer, even as the white flowers turn into scented oil against my skin? There's so much in there. His grief and his gratitude, and mostly a sense of wonder at a beauty so unexpected it left him gobsmacked in his garden. Broke him open to let this come out, so that it could break me open while I drank my coffee and went through my emails. And then, as I usually do when I've read a poetry that moves me, I forwarded it to Nyla, who is one of our resident real poets. I only dabble in poetry, so I like to share these things with real poets. And then the next morning, I found this in my inbox. For my friend weeping at the coffee shop, by Nyla Francis. Because he is reading a poem about peonies, which is really not about peonies, but maybe about prayer, the truest kind, or about grief and how we're spared a home in its depths, given just enough soil to catch our knees, collapse in the dark, stay until we remember some purpose beyond pain, past uncertainty, begin to uncurl under a faint light that insists on pulling us up, breathing us nursling green, tender bloom, this unimaginable bravery to come undone and still be summoned by trembling touch to a life that wants us wholly here, a delicate beauty amid so much else we call beautiful, the wild pen, these rivered lines, the morning shaken open. If I told you I hardly even knew how to cradle this tender, vulnerable joy, would you believe me? The Transfiguration story, whatever else it is a story of being cracked open, opened up, a story of wonder, of awe, of seeing in a new way, if only for a moment, but for a moment that echoes in the moments that come after it. It's also a story of vulnerability because these things break through our defenses. Again, the three Gospels that include the story, they have their own ways of telling it, some subtle differences between them, but they all put it in the same order of things in the storytelling itself, which means that they all place it right after, well, a few days after, but right after in the story, the first time that Jesus predicts his own death. It's as if to say that he clearly saw the violence of this world and his own mortality, and that living in that reality, and maybe even embracing it instead of running from it, opened him up to an experience of love that is even deeper and stronger than the violence of deathly systems. It cracked him open, it strengthened his resolve, and it spilled over into the people around him as well. So have you ever felt broken open? Leonard Cohen did. I am certain of that. His song Anthem is one of the best testaments imaginable to that feeling, I think. It's too long to play in this sermon. It's a 6-minute song. But I'll bet that at least a few of you are singing it in your heads right now, or intoning it. Cohen's voice is kind of outside of musical pitch, so I'm not always sure that singing is the right verb. But it's a great song. Anyhow, it starts at the beginning of a day, and it counsels just being present to the day. It says, the birds they sang at the break of day. Start again, I heard them say. Don't dwell on what has passed away or what is yet to be. It sounds like a lyric that might have come from Cohen's Buddhism, but it might also have come from his Judaism and his professed affinity for a certain first-century Palestinian Jewish rabbi who said, do not worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Cohen's next verse names some of that trouble, which is trouble that plays itself out again and again in history. Ah, the wars, they will be fought again. I'm not even going to attempt to mimic his voice. The wars, they will be fought again. The holy dove, she will be caught again. Bought and sold and bought again. The dove is never free. It sounds fatalistic, or maybe that's just another word for realistic. Whatever the case, despite that truth, the truth of the warmongers, there is glory and comfort and love to be found. He strikes up this chorus, ring the bells that still will ring, in spite of everything. Ring the bells that still will ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And that sense of the lights, the imperfect lights, the glory that shines through anyway, is what grounds him and sustains him. It's not a distraction that keeps him quiet in the face of what is wrong, but instead it moves him and stirs his rage about, he says, the killers in high places who say their prayers out loud. But he says they've summoned up a thundercloud. They're going to hear from me. The broken open moments, the wonder and the awe, the transfigurations are the fuel of the Spirit. When you have nothing left to run on wonder. In the 19th century, the Jesuit priest and poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, singing group, same guy who wrote the poem we started working on for our Easter song, he put his own sense of being gobsmacked and broken open by the world into his poem, God's Grandeur. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the opening stanzas say, the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. The ooze of oil. And there again, we're back to Reginald Dwayne Betts on his knees in his garden, praying, weeping, whatever he was doing with those white peonies as he crushed the petals and got fragrant oil on his skin. Crushed, cracked. It's all crushed and cracked and ugly these days. You don't need my litany of things. But at some point, the cracks will give way. We need to do our part in bringing out and building on something better, something beautiful, something generous, something courageous, not small and ugly and mean. In the meantime, look for the cracks and the cracked moments in the world and yourself. That's how the light gets in and out. This is God's good news. Amen.